"Do you even know what that uniform means, sir?" The word "sir" was not a title of respect. It was a weapon. It was a blade made of sarcasm. Corporal Benson's voice carried through the tent, bouncing off steel poles and canvas seams. The elderly man, seated near the medical kits, kept his gaze downward. His hands rested like brittle branches on his knees. No anger, no defense, just stillness. His coat was older than half the Marines in that tent, his insignia threadbare, too quiet to be impressive. And that is exactly why Benson felt bold. Several Marines lingered nearby, pretending to sort gear, but really watching this unfolding cruelty. Benson scoffed, stepping closer. "You should not be wearing that rank. Not here. Not among real Marines." The tent, large and cavernous in its drab olive hue, seemed to shrink around them. The smell of dust, oil, and heated canvas pressed into every corner. A faint trace of coffee and boiled water mingled with the metallic tang of the folding tables scattered with medical kits and historical displays. Families drifted in and out of the scene, holding brochures about old campaigns, frozen mid-step as Benson's voice cut sharper than the edges of the folding metal chairs. One small boy held his mother's hand a little tighter, sensing the unease even without fully understanding why. Conversations dissolved, replaced by a tense silence that rippled across the tent. Benson leaned forward, his crisp boots pressing against the gravel-strewn canvas floor, echoing faintly with each movement. "I mean it," he said, voice rising, just enough to command attention without being overtly loud. "Those stars, that patch, it's nothing. You aren't a Marine, not in this era, not among men who earn it every day." The words hung in the air like smoke from a spent flare. A few young Marines smirked behind him, but even they shifted uncomfortably as the gravity of the silence pressed down on them. The old man remained still, the lines in his hands tight as if they held decades of unspoken stories, his knuckles pale and worn. Nearby, a faded lapel pin glimmered faintly in the dim light, a tiny emblem pinned to the old man's coat. Benson's. Eyes caught it, curiosity sparking before derision could follow. "What's this?" he asked, voice sharp, almost sneering. "Is this some kind of souvenir, a badge for Grandpa's tales?" The old man's gaze never moved, but his fingers twitched slightly over the edge of the pin, tracing its shape in a motion so subtle it could have been mistaken for a mere habit. The pin seemed almost alive under the tent lights, holding more weight than the words Benson spoke. A mother with a stroller shifted her child back as a low gust rattled the canvas walls. A volunteer shuffled papers on a nearby table but kept glancing toward the old man, sensing the tension building like a storm. Benson, emboldened by the attention, straightened and gestured with one hand, as if physically pointing the disgrace at the man. "You think you can sit here and parade that uniform? I've seen privates with more courage than you," he said. His words, though cutting, barely registered with the old man, who remained silent, absorbed in a world Benson could not see. Every detail in the tent seemed amplified. The smell of worn leather and oil, the faint rattling of tent flaps in the breeze, the glint of sunlight off dusty metal crates, the distant hum of base activity outside. All of it combined to underscore the humiliation. Benson's attempt to dominate the space through mockery and arrogance, while the old man's silence and quiet presence became a challenge in itself. The tension stretched taut, like a bowstring, ready to snap, each second heavier than the last, until the air seemed almost solid, pressing against everyone within the tent, waiting for something to break. Benson stepped even closer, the soles of his boots crunching softly against the gravel scattered under the tent floor. Each motion was deliberate, a calculated demonstration of dominance, and the young Marines behind him mirrored his posture, some crossing their arms, others smirking nervously, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. The old man's gaze remained fixed on the worn canvas wall, but the subtle twitch of his fingers hinted at the storm beneath his calm exterior. His hands, gnarled and thin, bore the map of countless years, the faint scars, the faded calluses, marks of labor, struggle, and sacrifice that no uniform could fabricate. "Sir," Benson hissed again, voice slicing through the murmur of the few lingering civilians. "Do you even know what it means to wear that rank? To carry that responsibility? Or are you just pretending?" He leaned forward, forcing his face closer to the old man's, the faint scent of his fresh uniform mixing with the heavy, metallic air of the tent. The elderly man did not flinch. His chest rose and fell slowly, the rhythm of his breathing measured, almost meditative. Around them, the ambient sounds of the tent, the shuffle of papers, the creak of folding chairs, the distant hum of generators seemed to shrink, as though the space itself was holding its breath. Benson's gaze drifted to the faded insignia pinned above the old man's heart. The threadbare patch, nearly invisible in the dim light, seemed insignificant to the young Marine, yet his eyes narrowed with mockery. "What's this?" he said, tone dripping with contempt. "A toy? A souvenir for your retirement? That's not real. That can't be real." He laughed softly, a sound meant to punctuate the insult, but even that small chuckle caught in the tent's dense air. The old man's fingers moved imperceptibly toward the pin, brushing its edge in a motion that was quiet, precise, and deliberate, as if acknowledging a memory too deep for words. Two families nearby froze mid-step, their eyes darting between Benson and the old man. The mother, holding her child, drew him slightly closer, whispering softly, while an older veteran volunteer paused in his work, glancing over spectacles with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. The canvas walls flapped slightly in a sudden gust of wind, producing a low, hollow resonance that underscored the tension. Benson's smirk widened. "You don't belong here," he continued, voice rising just enough to assert authority. "Not among those who fight, who bleed, who earn every stripe. You're a shadow pretending to be something you're not." The old man's silence deepened the unease. It was not weakness nor fear. It was a presence so steady and deliberate that it warped the attention of every person in the tent. The faint twitch of his fingers across the patch became a silent challenge, a subtle reminder that the insignia held meaning far beyond Benson's comprehension. Even the air seemed to press against Benson, constricting around him with the weight of unseen history. Benson, sensing the growing attention, pressed further, gesturing toward the old man's posture, his back curved slightly from age, his frame frail against the sharp lines of military authority. "I've seen privates with more courage," he sneered. "I've seen civilians carry more honor in a single day than you could in a lifetime." The words hung in the air like sparks over dry brush, threatening to ignite, while the crowd, silent and apprehensive, absorbed every syllable. The tent's temperature seemed heavier, the metallic scent of crates and tables sharper, every fold of canvas a witness to the mounting humiliation. For a moment, the world narrowed to a single thread, Benson's arrogance pressing forward, the old man's unyielding stillness, and the subtle, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of the insignia, a small emblem holding the weight of decades, ready to tip the scales at the right moment. The faint glint of the pin caught the old man's eye, and in that instant, the present began to dissolve. The noises of the GP tent, the scuffing boots, Benson's mocking tone, the distant hum of generators, faded into a dim haze. The scent of canvas and diesel gave way to something heavier, something metallic and wet, laced with smoke and the sharp tang of gunpowder. Rain hammered relentlessly against tin roofs, puddles forming mud that sucked at boots with every step. The sun, though hidden, cast pale grey light across the shattered landscape of a forward operating base years before. When the old man had been a young lieutenant, shoulders squared, adrenaline coursing, decisions measured in seconds and lives. He was crouched behind the twisted hull of a half-destroyed truck, mud splattered across his uniform, face streaked with grime and sweat. Around him, the cries of wounded men blended with the distant roar of artillery and the staccato rattle of rifles. His hands gripped a rifle, knuckles white, fingers aching, heart hammering, as he barked orders to men half his age. Each command carried weight, each hesitation a potential death sentence. He had seen friends fall, heard their final breaths whispered into the storm, and still had to press forward to hold the perimeter, to guide the terrified men under him through the chaos that had swallowed everything familiar. A mortar landed nearby, shaking the earth beneath him, sending mud spraying across the cracked helmets of the men huddled with him. He pushed a fallen comrade aside, rolling to cover, feeling the thrum of life and death so closely it became physical, tangible, like the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. In that moment, he had made a decision to charge forward alone, risking everything to evacuate a group trapped by an advancing unit. A decision that would save lives, but leave him marked by scars unseen by the outside world. His boots pressed against mud, slipping, struggling, fighting every inch as he dragged men to safety. The rain soaking through every layer of fabric, every muscle screaming. His mind locked in absolute focus, and yet there was beauty. Two brief glimpses of courage in the terrified faces of young Marines, resilience in the camaraderie that bound them, the unspoken promise that they would not fail one another. That day he had been ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. His body pushed beyond limits, his spirit tempered by fire, and the insignia he would wear decades later was earned not in ceremony, but in the mud, in the gunfire, in the quiet whispers of men whose lives had been placed in his hands. The memory ebbed slowly, the sounds of battle fading as the present reclaimed him. The faint hum of the GP tent returned, Benson's mocking voice scraping against the edges of reality, the smell of oil and coffee and heated canvas enveloping him once more. But now the old man's fingers rested deliberately on the faded pin, a small emblem that had been present in countless operations, a silent witness to heroism no longer bound by time. He exhaled slowly, a measured breath, the tension in his shoulders tightening before relaxing, carrying the weight of unspoken history. The young Marine, oblivious, still leaned forward, still demanding proof, still unaware that history itself was seated in the chair before him. The pin glimmered in the weak light, a bridge between past and present, a symbol that spoke louder than any words could. The flap of the tent shifted sharply, catching the attention of everyone present. The faint rustle of canvas was punctuated by heavy, deliberate footsteps on the gravel floor outside. Conversations halted mid-word. Benson, confident a moment ago, paused, uncertain, his gaze flicking toward the source of the sound. The air seemed to grow denser, charged with an unspoken gravity that made even the generator's hum fade into the background. From the entrance stepped a figure tall and immaculately poised, boots polished, uniform pressed, bearing the weight of decades of service in every measured movement. A gunnery sergeant, or perhaps higher, though none of the young Marines could place the rank immediately. His presence alone silencing the room. The old man remained seated, unflinching, though his shoulders straightened subtly, a quiet acknowledgement of recognition passing over his features. The officer's eyes locked on him immediately, sharp and precise, a flicker of understanding passing like a current between them. The tent seemed to contract, every metal crate, every folding chair, every inch of canvas now aligned with this singular moment. Families shifted instinctively, moving closer to one another, sensing that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary comprehension. The warmth of the generators, the faint scent of coffee and oil, even the rustling of tent walls, all became secondary to the commanding gravity of the officer's presence. Benson blinked, his smirk faltering. He took a cautious step back, sensing the subtle shift in power, though he could not yet articulate why. The officer spoke, his voice calm but resolute, carrying the authority of countless campaigns and decades of earned respect. "Lieutenant Harold Winters," he said, each word deliberate, weighty. The young Marines froze. Even the civilians turned fully, following the officer's gaze toward the old man. "He retired, yes. But do not mistake age for insignificance. This man served in operations you have only read about. Every decoration, every campaign, every life saved, earned under fire. With courage and precision you cannot imagine. The old man's hand brushed once more against the faded pin, the small emblem now glowing with significance in the officer's acknowledgement. Benson's jaw tightened, confusion mingling with rising dread. The authority figure's eyes swept the room, resting on each Marine in turn, his posture unyielding. You will address him with the respect due. That patch, that rank, history confirms it, not hearsay. Every man here owes acknowledgement for the sacrifices made, often unseen, often unspoken. Benson attempted to speak, his voice faltering, trying to regain control, but the words caught in his throat. The young Marines behind him shifted uncomfortably, their own arrogance dissolving under the weight of undeniable truth. Even the families, some of whom had drifted toward the exhibits, now stood rooted, feeling the gravity of history manifest in real time. Standing before them in the figure of an old man who had earned every inch of his insignia. The officer stepped closer to Harold Winters, not to protect, but to honor. His hand rested briefly on the older man's shoulder, a subtle gesture confirming everything unspoken. The air was thick, almost tactile, with anticipation and awe. The small emblem on the coat, once mocked, now radiated significance. The tension built, a slow crescendo, as if the entire tent recognized that a moment of profound revelation was unfolding. Benson's voice, when it finally returned, was subdued, uncertain, the blade of sarcasm dulled by the weight of history before him. Silence reigned, the kind that presses against the skin, that settles into the bones. The old man remained calm, a silent sentinel, his dignity intact, the decades of service now recognized not just in words, but in the reactions of all present. The tent fell completely silent. Not the silence of absence, but a silence heavy with recognition, anticipation, and awe. Every pair of eyes, from the young Marines to the families lingering near the historical displays, was fixed on Harold Winters. The old man, still seated, allowed himself a subtle exhale, measured and deliberate, as if he were drawing in decades of memory and releasing it quietly into the air. The pin on his coat, the small emblem once mocked, now glimmered faintly under the tent's muted light, a symbol of heroism and sacrifice impossible to dismiss. Benson's bravado evaporated like mist over cold gravel. His chest heaved, the earlier swagger replaced by a growing weight of realization. The authority figure, standing a mere few steps behind Winters, now addressed the young Marines directly. You are in the presence of a man who commanded units in situations where failure meant death, where courage was not optional, and where every decision could cost lives. This patch, this rank is not decoration. It is the record of service, sacrifice, and steadfast leadership. Show respect. For a heartbeat, the tent seemed suspended in time. The air was thick with the mingling scents of heated canvas, oil, and the faint metallic tang of history that seemed to emanate from Winters himself. Each Marine's posture shifted instinctively, shoulders straightening, heads tilting slightly, a reflexive acknowledgement of the power and weight now fully apparent. Benson's gaze flickered between Winters and the emblem on his coat, the realization etching itself across his face in visible disbelief. The authority figure's hand gestured subtly, commanding attention without a single raised voice. Stand at attention. You will recognize rank. You will honor service. You will acknowledge history. Slowly, hesitantly at first, Benson's legs locked into place. He straightened, boots scraping lightly against the gravel, and offered the salute, awkward, uncertain, but sincere in its own way. One by one, the other Marines mirrored him, the motion precise, deliberate, carried out under the weight of truth now undeniable. The families watched, rapt, some pressing hands to mouths, their breaths shallow as the magnitude of the moment unfolded before them. Winters rose slowly from the folding chair, movements deliberate and measured. Age had bent his frame, but it could not diminish the dignity radiating from every gesture. The pin on his coat caught the faint overhead light once more, gleaming with quiet authority. He allowed a small nod to the authority figure behind him, a mutual acknowledgement of unspoken history and respect. No words were necessary. The silence spoke volumes. Even Benson's voice, when it finally returned, was subdued, low, tinged with awe. I'm sorry, sir, he murmured, eyes lowered. The phrase seemed insufficient against the magnitude of what had transpired, yet it was the only utterance he could manage. The tent remained hushed, the moment lingering like a living entity, stretching seconds into eternity. Every subtle detail, the faint steam from coffee cups, the creak of folding chairs, the low hum of the generators, now seemed accentuated, giving weight to the realization that greatness often hides behind quiet forms. Waiting only for acknowledgement, Winters, calm and unhurried, allowed himself a final glance at the Marines. His eyes held no anger, only a steady, unwavering authority earned through decades of courage, sacrifice, and unspoken heroism. The moral was unmistakable. Respect is not given lightly, it is earned, and the true measure of a person often lies beneath what the world can see. The old man's silence, his dignity, and the emblem on his chest had shifted the balance entirely, transforming humiliation into reverence, arrogance into humility. The old man remained standing, his frame still slightly bent with age, but his presence now filled the tent more completely than any uniform or display could. The young Marines, including Benson, held their positions at attention, eyes lowered respectfully, a quiet reverence settling like a tangible weight. The families, who had watched the entire encounter unfold, exhaled slowly, realizing they had witnessed more than a lesson in discipline. They had seen history incarnate, embodied in a man who had lived courage, sacrifice, and leadership beyond comprehension. Winter's voice finally cut through the silence, soft but carrying undeniable authority. "I have lived a long life," he began, each word deliberate, "and in that time I have seen bravery in countless forms. I have seen men rise in moments of fear, take impossible chances, and carry one another through hell on earth. But the lesson I ask you to remember is this: respect is not merely a protocol. It is acknowledgement of sacrifice, acknowledgement of service, acknowledgement of the unseen burdens carried quietly, often without recognition. It is given not for appearances, but for truth. That is the weight of honor." Benson's eyes were fixed on Winters, and for the first time he truly absorbed the measure of the man before him. The arrogance, the smirk, the impulsive mockery, all of it fell away, leaving a hollow, humbled space in its place. He shifted slightly, boots scraping softly against the gravel-strewn floor, and exhaled. "Yes, sir," he whispered, a simple acknowledgement, but it carried all the weight of repentance and newfound understanding. The gunnery sergeant, or colonel, who had arrived earlier, nodded once at Winters, a quiet gesture of mutual respect, before stepping back and allowing the old man to move toward the exit. Winters' hand brushed lightly against the faded pin on his coat, a silent gesture of reverence, connection, and memory. That small emblem, once the target of mockery, now held profound significance, a bridge between decades of courage and the present moment of understanding. As Winters passed through the tent flap, the weight of silence lifted slightly, replaced by a quiet murmur of awe. Families resumed their steps, conversations resumed in whispers, but the air retained the imprint of what had transpired. The young Marines, standing straighter, felt a shift within themselves, a recognition that humility must follow arrogance, and that true leadership is earned, not assumed. Benson, still at attention, allowed a subtle nod, a wordless apology conveyed not through speech, but through posture, presence, and acknowledgement. Winters paused briefly outside, looking back at the tent, the folds of canvas framing him like a final tableau. His gaze settled on the emblem, on the uniform, on the generations of men and women who would carry forward lessons unseen. Then slowly he turned and walked away, each step deliberate, measured, the weight of a lifetime pressing into each footfall. The lesson lingered in the air, heavy, palpable, that greatness is quiet, that courage is often invisible, and that respect is not merely asked for. It is earned and given in recognition of what is unseen, but always remembered. And in that moment, the GP tent became more than a temporary shelter. It became a witness to history, humility, and redemption. A faded pin, a silent old man, and the echo of decades past had transformed arrogance into reverence, teaching everyone present that the measure of a person is rarely in appearances, but always in the deeds they have lived. For those who honor the unseen sacrifices, the story is never truly finished.